An empire across 3 continents. The Roman Empire covered a vast stretch of territory that included most of Europe as we know it today, and a large part of the Fertile Crescent and North Africa. In this chapter, we shall look at the way this empire was organized, the political forces that shaped its destiny, and the social groups into which people were divided. You will see that the empire embraced a wealth of local cultures and languages, that women had a stronger legal position then than they do in many countries today, but also that much of the economy was run on slave labor, denying freedom to substantial numbers of persons. From the 5th century on, the empire fell apart in the West, but remained intact and exceptionally prosperous in its eastern half. The caliphate, which you will read about in the next chapter, built on this prosperity and inherited its urban and religious traditions. Roman historians have a rich collection of sources to go on, which we can broadly divide into 3 groups: A. Texts, B. Documents, and C. Material remains. Textual sources include histories of the period written by contemporaries. These were usually called annals because the narrative was constructed on a year-by-year basis: letters, speeches, sermons, laws, and so on. Documentary sources include mainly inscriptions and papyri. Inscriptions were usually cut on stone, so a large number survive, in both Greek and Latin. The papyrus was a reed-like plant that grew along the banks of the Nile in Egypt and was processed to produce a writing material that was very widely used in everyday life. Thousands of contracts, accounts, letters, and official documents survive on papyrus and have been published by scholars who are called papyrologists. Material remains include a very wide assortment of items that mainly archaeologists discover, for example, through excavation and field survey, for example, buildings, monuments, and other kinds of structures, pottery, coins, mosaics, even entire landscapes, for example, through the use of aerial photography. Each of these sources can only tell us just so much about the past, and combining them can be a fruitful exercise, but how well this is done depends on the historian's skill. 2 powerful empires ruled over most of Europe: North Africa and the Middle East in the period between the birth of Christ and the early part of the 7th century, say, down to the 630s. The 2 empires were those of Rome and Iran. The Romans and Iranians were rivals and fought against each other for much of their history. Their empires lay next to each other, separated only by a narrow strip of land that ran along the river Euphrates. In this chapter, we shall be looking at the Roman Empire, but we shall also refer, in passing, to Rome's rival, Iran. If you look at the map, you will see that the continents of Europe and Africa are separated by a sea that stretches all the way from Spain in the west to Syria in the east. This sea is called the Mediterranean, and it was the heart of Rome's empire. Rome dominated the Mediterranean and all the regions around that sea in both directions, north as well as south. To the north, the boundaries of the empire were formed by 2 great rivers, the Rhine and the Danube. To the south, by the huge expanse of desert called the Sahara. This vast stretch of territory was the Roman Empire. Iran controlled the whole area south of the Caspian Sea down to eastern Arabia, and sometimes large parts of Afghanistan as well. These 2 superpowers had divided up most of the world that the Chinese called Ta Qin, Greater Qin, roughly the West. The early empire. The Roman Empire can broadly be divided into 2 phases, early and late, divided by the 3rd century as a sort of historical watershed between them. In other words, the whole period down to the main part of the 3rd century can be called the early empire, and the period after that the late empire. A major difference between the 2 superpowers and their respective empires was that the Roman Empire was culturally much more diverse than that of Iran. The Parthians and later the Sasanians, the dynasties that ruled Iran in this period, ruled over a population that was largely Iranian. The Roman Empire, by contrast, was a mosaic of territories and cultures that were chiefly bound together by a common system of government. Many languages were spoken in the empire, but for the purposes of administration, Latin and Greek were the most widely used, indeed the only languages. The upper classes of the East spoke and wrote in Greek, those of the West in Latin, and the boundary between these broad language areas ran somewhere across the middle of the Mediterranean, between the African provinces of Tripolitania, which was Latin-speaking, and Cyrenaica, Greek-speaking. All those who lived in the empire were subjects of a single ruler, the emperor, regardless of where they lived and what language they spoke. The regime established by Augustus, the first emperor, in 27 BC was called the Principate. Although Augustus was the sole ruler and the only real source of authority, the fiction was kept alive that he was actually only the leading citizen princeps in Latin, not the absolute ruler. This was done out of respect for the Senate, the body which had controlled Rome earlier. In the days when it was a republic, the Senate had existed in Rome for centuries, and had been and remained a body representing the aristocracy, that is, the wealthiest families of Roman and, later, Italian descent, mainly landowners. Most of the Roman histories that survive in Greek and Latin were written by people from a senatorial background. From these, it is clear that emperors were judged by how they behaved towards the Senate. The worst emperors were those who were hostile to the senatorial class, behaving with suspicion or brutality and violence. Many senators yearned to go back to the days of the Republic, but most must have realized that this was impossible. Next to the emperor and the Senate, the other key institution of imperial rule was the army. Unlike the army of its rival in the Persian Empire, which was a conscripted *** army, the Romans had a paid professional army where soldiers had to put in a minimum of 25 years of service. Indeed, the existence of a paid army was a distinctive feature of the Roman Empire. The army was the largest single organized body in the empire, 600,000 by the 4th century, and it certainly had the power to determine the fate of emperors. The soldiers would constantly agitate for better wages and service conditions. These agitations often took the form of mutinies if the soldiers felt let down by their generals or even the emperor. Again, our picture of the Roman army depends largely on the way they were portrayed by historians with senatorial sympathies. The Senate hated and feared the army because it was a source of often unpredictable violence, especially in the tense conditions of the 3rd century when government was forced to tax more heavily to pay for its mounting military expenditures. To sum up, the emperor, the aristocracy, and the army were the 3 main players in the political history of the empire. The success of individual emperors depended on their control of the army, and when the armies were divided, the result usually was civil war except for one notorious year, 69 C, when 4 emperors mounted the throne in quick succession. The first 2 centuries were on the whole free from civil war and in this sense relatively stable. Succession to the throne was based as far as possible on family descent, either natural or adoptive, and even the army was strongly wedded to this principle. For example, Tiberius, 14 to 37 C, the second in the long line of Roman emperors, was not the natural son of Augustus, the ruler who founded the Principate, but Augustus adopted him to ensure a smooth transition. External warfare was also much less common in the first 2 centuries. The empire inherited by Tiberius from Augustus was already so vast that further expansion was felt to be unnecessary. In fact, the Augustan age is remembered for the peace it ushered in after decades of internal strife and centuries of military conquest. The only major campaign of expansion in the early empire was Trajan's fruitless occupation of territory across the Euphrates in the years 113 to 17 CE, abandoned by his successors. Much more characteristic was the gradual extension of Roman direct rule. This was accomplished by absorbing a whole series of dependent kingdoms into Roman provincial territory. The Near East was full of such kingdoms but by the early 2nd century those which lay west of the Euphrates, towards Roman territory, had disappeared, swallowed up by Rome. Incidentally, some of these kingdoms were exceedingly wealthy. For example, Herod's kingdom yielded the equivalent of 5.4 million denarii per year, equal to over 125,000 kilograms of gold. The denarius was a Roman silver coin containing about 4.5 gm of pure silver. In fact, except for Italy, which was not considered a province in these centuries. All the territories of the empire were organized into provinces and subject to taxation. At its peak in the 2nd century, the Roman Empire stretched from Scotland to the borders of Armenia, and from the Sahara to the Euphrates and sometimes beyond. Given that there was no government in the modern sense to help them to run things, you may well ask, how is it possible for the emperor to cope with the control and administration of such a vast and diverse set of territories, with a population of some 60 million in the mid-2nd century? The answer lies in the urbanization of the empire. The great urban centers that line the shores of the Mediterranean, Carthage, Alexandria, Antioch were the biggest among them, were the true bedrock of the imperial system. It was through the cities that government was able to tax the provincial countrysides, which generated much of the wealth of the empire. What this means is that the local upper classes actively collaborated with the Roman state in administering their own territories and raising taxes from them. In fact, one of the most interesting aspects of Roman political history is the dramatic shift in power between Italy and the provinces. Throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries, it was the provincial upper classes who supplied most of the cadre that governed the provinces and commanded the armies. They came to form a new elite of administrators and military commanders who became much more powerful than the senatorial class because they had the backing of the emperors. As this new group emerged, the Emperor Gallienus, 253 to 68, consolidated their rise to power by excluding senators from military command. We are told that Gallienus forbade senators from serving in the army or having access to it in order to prevent control of the empire from falling into their hands. To sum up, in the late 1st, 2nd, and early 3rd centuries, the army and administration were increasingly drawn from the provinces. As citizenship spread to these regions and was no longer confined to Italy. But individuals of Italian origin continued to dominate the Senate at least till the 3rd century, when senators of provincial origin became a majority. These trends reflected the general decline of Italy within the empire, both political and economic, and the rise of new elites in the wealthier and more urbanized parts of the Mediterranean, such as the south of Spain, Africa, and the East. A city in the Roman sense was an urban center with its own magistrates, city council, and a territory containing villages which were under its jurisdiction. Thus, one city could not be in the territory of another city, but villages almost always were. Villages could be upgraded to the status of cities, and vice versa, usually as a mark of imperial favor, or the opposite. One crucial advantage of living in a city was simply that it might be better provided for during food shortages and even famines than the countryside. Public baths were a striking feature of Roman urban life. When one Iranian ruler tried to introduce them into Iran, he encountered the wrath of the clergy there. Water was a sacred element, and to use it for public bathing may have seemed a desecration to them, and urban populations also enjoyed a much higher level of entertainment. For example, one calendar tells us that spectacular shows filled no less than 176 days of the year. The 3rd century crisis. If the 1st and 2nd centuries were by and large a period of peace, prosperity, and economic expansion, the 3rd century brought the first major signs of internal strain. From the 230s, the empire found itself fighting on several fronts simultaneously. In Iran, a new and more aggressive dynasty emerged in 225. They called themselves the Sasanians, and within just 15 years were expanding rapidly in the direction of the Euphrates. In a famous rock inscription cut in 3 languages, Shapur I, the Iranian ruler, claimed he had annihilated a Roman army of 60,000 and even captured the eastern capital of Antioch. Meanwhile, a whole series of Germanic tribes, or rather tribal confederacies, most notably the Alemanni, the Franks, and the Goths, began to move against the Rhine and Danube frontiers, and the whole period from 233 to 280 saw repeated invasions of a whole line of provinces that stretched from the Black Sea to the Alps and southern Germany. The Romans were forced to abandon much of the territory beyond the Danube, while the emperors of this period were constantly in the field against what the Romans called barbarians. The rapid succession of emperors in the 3rd century, 25 emperors in 47 years, is an obvious symptom of the strains faced by the empire in this period. Gender, literacy, culture. One of the more modern features of Roman society was the widespread prevalence of the nuclear family. Adult sons did not live with their families, and it was exceptional for adult brothers to share a common household. On the other hand, slaves were included in the family as the Romans understood this. By the late Republic, the 1st century, the typical form of marriage was one where the wife did not transfer to her husband's authority, but retained full rights in the property of her natal family. While the woman's dowry went to the husband for the duration of the marriage, the woman remained a primary heir of her father and became an independent property owner on her father's death. Thus, Roman women enjoyed considerable legal rights in owning and managing property. In other words, in law, the married couple was not one financial entity but two, and the wife enjoyed complete legal independence. Divorce was relatively easy and needed no more than a notice of intent to dissolve the marriage by either husband or wife. On the other hand, whereas males married in their late 20s or early 30s, women were married off in the late teens or early 20s, so there was an age gap between husband and wife, and this would have encouraged a certain inequality. Marriages were generally arranged, and there is no doubt that women were often subject to domination by their husbands. Augustine Asterisk, the great Catholic bishop who spent most of his life in North Africa, tells us that his mother was regularly beaten by his father and that most other wives in the small town where he grew up had similar bruises to show. Finally, fathers had substantial legal control over their children, sometimes to a shocking degree. For example, a legal power of life and death in exposing unwanted children by leaving them out in the cold to die. It is certain that rates of casual literacy asterisk varied greatly between different parts of the empire. For example, in Pompeii, which was buried in a volcanic eruption in 79, there is strong evidence of widespread casual literacy. Walls on the main streets of Pompeii often carried advertisements, and graffiti were found all over the city. By contrast, in Egypt, where hundreds of papyri survive, most formal documents such as contracts were usually written by professional scribes, and they often tell us that X or Y is unable to read and write. But even here, literacy was certainly more widespread among certain categories such as soldiers, army officers, and estate managers. The cultural diversity of the empire was reflected in many ways and at many levels, in the vast diversity of religious cults and local deities, the plurality of languages that were spoken, the styles of dress and costume, the food people ate, their forms of social organization, tribal/non-tribal, even their patterns of settlement. Aramaic was the dominant language group of the Near East, at least west of the Euphrates. Coptic was spoken in Egypt, Punic and Berber in North Africa, Celtic in Spain and the Northwest. But many of these linguistic cultures were purely oral, at least until a script was invented for them. Armenian, for example, only began to be written as late as the 5th century, whereas there was already a Coptic translation of the Bible by the middle of the 3rd century. Elsewhere, the spread of Latin displaced the written form of languages that were otherwise widespread. This happened notably with Celtic, which ceased to be written after the 1st century. Economic expansion. The empire had a substantial economic infrastructure of harbors, mines, quarries, brickyards, olive oil factories, etc. Wheat, wine, and olive oil were traded and consumed in huge quantities, and they came mainly from Spain, the Gallic provinces, North Africa, Egypt, and, to a lesser extent, Italy, where conditions were best for these crops. Liquids like wine and olive oil were transported in containers called amphorae. The fragments and sherds of a very large number of these survive. Monte Testaccio in Rome is said to contain the remnants of over 50 million vessels, and it has been possible for archaeologists to reconstruct the precise shapes of these containers, tell us what they carried, and say exactly where they were made by examining the clay content and matching the finds with clay pits throughout the Mediterranean. In this way, we can now say with some confidence that Spanish olive oil, to take just one example, was a vast commercial enterprise that reached its peak in the years 140 to 160. The Spanish olive oil of this period was mainly carried in a container called Dressel 20, after the archaeologist who first established its form. If finds of Dressel 20 are widely scattered across sites in the Mediterranean, this suggests that Spanish olive oil circulated very widely indeed. By using such evidence, the remains of amphorae of different kinds and their distribution maps, archaeologists are able to show that Spanish producers succeeded in capturing markets for olive oil from their Italian counterparts. This would only have happened if Spanish producers supplied a better quality oil at lower prices. In other words, the big landowners from different regions competed with each other for control of the main markets for the goods they produced. The success of the Spanish olive growers was then repeated by North African producers. Olive estates in this part of the empire dominated production through most of the 3rd and 4th centuries. This raises the issue of labor and of the use of slavery. The success of the Spanish olive growers was then repeated by North African producers. Olive estates in this part of the success of the Spanish olive growers was then repeated by North African producers. Olive estates in this part of the empire dominated production through most of the 3rd and 4th centuries. Later, after 425, North African dominance was broken by the East. In the later 5th and 6th centuries, the Aegean, Southern Asia Minor, Turkey, Syria, and Palestine became major exporters of wine and olive oil, and containers from Africa show a dramatically reduced presence on Mediterranean markets. Behind these broad movements, the prosperity of individual regions rose and fell depending on how effectively they could organize the production and transport of particular goods, and on the quality of those goods. The empire included many regions that had a reputation for exceptional fertility. Campania in Italy, Sicily, the Fayum in Egypt, Galilee, Byzantium, Tunisia, southern Gaul, called Gallia Narbonensis, and Baetica, southern Spain, were all among the most densely settled or wealthiest parts of the empire, according to writers like Strabo and Pliny. The best kinds of wine came from Campania. Sicily and Byzantium exported large quantities of wheat to Rome. Galilee was densely cultivated. Every inch of the soil has been cultivated by the inhabitants, wrote the historian Josephus, and Spanish olive oil came mainly from numerous estates, fundi, along the banks of the river Guadalquivir in the south of Spain. On the other hand, large expanses of Roman territory were in a much less advanced state. For example, transhumance * was widespread in the countryside of Numidia, modern Algeria. These pastoral and semi-nomadic communities were often on the move, carrying their oven-shaped huts, called mapalia, with them. As Roman estates expanded in North Africa, the pastures of those communities were drastically reduced and their movements more tightly regulated. Even in Spain, the north was much less developed and inhabited largely by a Celtic-speaking peasantry that lived in hilltop villages called castella. When we think of the Roman Empire, we should never forget these differences. We should also be careful not to imagine that because this was the ancient world, their forms of cultural and economic life were necessarily backward or primitive. On the contrary, diversified applications of water power around the Mediterranean, as well as advances in water-powered milling technology, the use of hydraulic mining techniques in the Spanish gold and silver mines, and the gigantic industrial scale on which those mines were worked in the 1st and 2nd centuries, with levels of output that would not be reached again till the 19th century. Some 1,700 years later, the existence of well-organized commercial and banking networks and the widespread use of money are all indications of how much we tend to underestimate the sophistication of the Roman economy. This raises the issue of labor and of the use of slavery. Transhumance is the herdsman's regular annual movement between the higher mountain regions and lowland ground in search of pasture for sheep and other flocks. Activity 3. Archaeologists who work on the remains of pottery are a bit like detectives. Can you explain why? Also, what can amphorae tell us about the economic life of the Mediterranean in the Roman period? Controlling workers. Slavery was an institution deeply rooted in the ancient world, both in the Mediterranean and in the Near East, and not even Christianity when it emerged and triumphed as the state religion in the 4th century, seriously challenged this institution. It does not follow that the bulk of the labor in the Roman economy was performed by slaves. That may have been true of large parts of Italy in the Republican period. Under Augustus, there were still 3 million slaves in a total Italian population of 7.5 million, but it was no longer true of the empire as a whole. Slaves were an investment, and at least one Roman agricultural writer advised landowners against using them in contexts where too many might be required, for example, for harvests, or where their health could be damaged, for example, by malaria. These considerations were not based on any sympathy for the slaves, but on hard economic calculation. On the other hand, if the Roman upper classes were often brutal towards their slaves, ordinary people did sometimes show much more compassion. See what one historian says about a famous incident that occurred in the reign of Nero. As warfare became less widespread with the establishment of peace in the 1st century, the supply of slaves tended to decline, and the users of slave labor thus had to turn either to slave breeding * or to cheaper substitutes such as wage labor, which was more easily dispensable. In fact, free labor was extensively used on public works at Rome precisely because an extensive use of slave labor would have been too expensive. Unlike hired workers, slaves had to be fed and maintained throughout the year, which increased the cost of holding this kind of labor. This is probably why slaves are not widely found in the agriculture of the later period, at least not in the eastern provinces. On the other hand, they and freedmen, that is, slaves who had been set free by their masters, were extensively used as business managers, where, obviously, they were not required in large numbers. Masters often gave their slaves or freedmen capital to run businesses on their behalf, or even businesses of their own. The Roman agricultural writers paid a great deal of attention to the management of labor. Columella, a 1st century writer who came from the south of Spain, recommended that landowners should keep a reserve stock of implements and tools, twice as many as they needed, so that production could be continuous, for the loss in slave labor time exceeds the cost of such items. There was a general presumption. Tacitus, 55 to 117, historian of the early empire. Among employers that without supervision no work would ever get done, so supervision was paramount for both free workers and slaves. To make supervision easier, workers were sometimes grouped into gangs or smaller teams. Columella recommended squads of 10, claiming it was easier to tell who was putting in effort and who was not in work groups of this size. This shows a detailed consideration of the management of labor. Pliny the Elder, the author of a very famous natural history, condemned the use of slave gangs as the worst method of organizing production, mainly because slaves who worked in gangs were usually chained together by their feet. All this looks draconian *, but we should remember that most factories in the world today enforce similar principles of labor control. Indeed, some industrial establishments in the empire enforced even tighter controls. The elder Pliny described conditions. In the frankincense ** factories, Epicene, of Alexandria, where, he tells us, no amount of supervision seemed to suffice. A seal is put upon the workmen's aprons, they have to wear a mask or a net with a close mesh on their heads, and before they are allowed to leave the premises, they have to take off all their clothes. Agricultural labor must have been fatiguing and disliked, for a famous edict of the early 3rd century refers to Egyptian peasants deserting their villages in order not to engage in agricultural work. The same was probably true of most factories and workshops. A law of 398 referred to workers being branded so they could be recognized if and when they run away and try to hide. Many private employers cast their agreements with workers in the form of debt contracts to be able to claim that their employees were in debt to them and thus ensure tighter control over them. An early, 2nd century writer tells us, thousands surrender themselves to work in servitude, although they are free. In other words, a lot of the poorer families went into debt bondage in order to survive. From one of the recently discovered letters of Augustine, we learn that parents sometimes sold their children into servitude for periods of 25 years. Augustine asked a lawyer friend of his whether these children could be liberated once the father died. Rural indebtedness was even more widespread. To take just one example, In the Great Jewish Revolt of 66 *, the revolutionaries destroyed the moneylenders' bonds to win popular support. Again, we should be careful not to conclude that the bulk of labor was coerced in these ways. The late 5th century Emperor Anastasius built the eastern frontier city of Dara in less than 3 weeks by attracting labor from all over the east by offering high wages. From the papyri, we can even form some estimate of how widespread wage labor had become in parts of the Mediterranean by the 6th century, especially in the east. Social hierarchies. Let us stand back from the details now and try and get a sense of the social structures of the empire. Tacitus described the leading social groups of the early empire as follows: senators, patres, lit, fathers, leading members of the equestrian class, the respectable section of the people, those attached to the great houses, the unkempt lower class, plebs sordida, who, he tells us, were addicted to the circus and theatrical displays, and finally the slaves. In the early 3rd century, when the Senate numbered roughly 1,000, approximately half of all senators still came from Italian families. By the late empire, which starts with the reign of Constantine I in the early part of the 4th century, the first 2 groups mentioned by Tacitus, the senators and the equites asterisk, had merged into a unified and expanded aristocracy, and at least half of all families were of African or Eastern origin. This late Roman aristocracy was enormously wealthy, but in many ways less powerful than the purely military elites who came almost entirely from non-aristocratic backgrounds. The middle class now consisted of the considerable mass of persons connected with imperial service in the bureaucracy and army, but also the more prosperous merchants and farmers, of whom there were many in the eastern provinces. Tacitus described this respectable middle class as clients of the great senatorial houses. Now it was chiefly government service and dependence on the state that sustained many of these families. Below them were the vast mass of the lower classes known collectively as humiliores, lit. Lower. They comprised a rural labor force of which many were permanently employed on the large estates, workers in industrial and mining establishments, migrant workers who supplied much of the labor for the grain and olive harvests and for the building industry. Self-employed artisans who, it was said, were better fed than wage laborers, a large mass of casual laborers, especially in the big cities, and of course the many thousands of slaves that were still found all over the Western Empire in particular. One writer of the early 5th century, the historian Olympiodorus, who was also an ambassador, tells us that the aristocracy based in the city of Rome drew annual incomes of up to 4,000 pounds of gold from their estates, not counting the produce they consumed directly. The monetary system of the late empire broke with the silver-based currencies of the first 3 centuries because the Spanish silver mines were exhausted and government ran out of sufficient stocks of the metal to support a stable coinage in silver. Constantine founded the new monetary system on gold, and there were vast amounts of this in circulation throughout late antiquity. The late Roman bureaucracy, both the higher and middle echelons, was a comparatively affluent group because it drew the bulk of its salary in gold and invested much of this in buying up assets like land. There was, of course, also a great deal of corruption, especially in the judicial system and in the administration of military supplies. The extortion of the higher bureaucracy and the greed of the provincial governors were proverbial. But government intervened repeatedly to curb these forms of corruption. We only know about them in the first place because of the laws that tried to put an end to them, and because historians and other members of the intelligentsia denounced such practices. This element of criticism is a remarkable feature of the classical world. The Roman state was an authoritarian regime. In other words, dissent was rarely tolerated and government usually responded to protest with violence, especially in the cities of the East where people were often fearless in making fun of emperors. Yet a strong tradition of Roman law had emerged by the 4th century, and this acted as a brake on even the most fearsome emperors. Emperors were not free to do whatever they liked, and the law was actively used to protect civil rights. That is why in the later 4th century it was possible for powerful bishops like Ambrose to confront equally powerful emperors when they were excessively harsh or repressive in their handling of the civilian population. Late Antiquity. We shall conclude this chapter by looking at the cultural transformation of the Roman world in its final centuries. Late Antiquity is the term now used to describe the final, fascinating period in the evolution and breakup of the Roman Empire and refers broadly to the 4th to 7th centuries. The 4th century itself was one of considerable ferment, both cultural and economic. At the cultural level, the period saw momentous developments in religious life, with the Emperor Constantine deciding to make Christianity the official religion, and with the rise of Islam in the 7th century. But there were equally important changes in the structure of the state that began with the Emperor Diocletian, 284-305, and it may be best to start with these. Overexpansion had led Diocletian to cut back by abandoning territories with little strategic or economic value. Diocletian also fortified the frontiers, reorganized provincial boundaries, and separated civilian from military functions, granting greater autonomy to the military commanders, duces, who now became a more powerful group. Constantine consolidated some of these changes and added others of his own. His chief innovations were in the monetary sphere, where he introduced a new denomination, the solidus, a coin of 4.5 GM of pure gold that would in fact outlast the Roman Empire itself. Solidi were minted on a very large scale, and their circulation ran into millions. The other area of innovation was the creation of a second capital at Constantinople, at the site of modern Istanbul in Turkey and previously called Byzantium, surrounded on 3 sides by the sea. As the new capital required a new senate, the 4th century was a period of rapid expansion of the governing classes. Monetary stability and an expanding population stimulated economic growth, and the archaeological record shows considerable investment in rural establishments, including industrial installations like oil presses and glass factories, in newer technologies such as screw presses and multiple water mills, and in a revival of the long-distance trade with the East. All of this carried over into strong urban prosperity that was marked by new forms of architecture and an exaggerated sense of luxury. The ruling elites were wealthier and more powerful than ever before. In Egypt, hundreds of papyri survive from these later centuries, and they show us a relatively affluent society where money was in extensive use and rural estates generated vast incomes in gold. For example, Egypt contributed taxes of over 2.5 million solidi a year, roughly 35,000 pounds of gold, in the reign of Justinian in the 6th century. Indeed, large parts of the Near Eastern countryside were more developed and densely settled in the 5th and 6th centuries than they would be even in the 20th century. This is the social background against which we should set the cultural developments of this period. The traditional religious culture of the classical world, both Greek and Roman, had been polytheist. That is, it involved a multiplicity of cults that included both Roman/Italian gods like Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, and Mars, as well as numerous Greek and Eastern deities worshipped in thousands of temples, shrines, and sanctuaries throughout them. Polytheists had no common name or label to describe themselves. The other great religious tradition in the empire was Judaism. But Judaism was not a monolith asterisk either, and there was a great deal of diversity within the Jewish communities of late antiquity. Thus, the Christianization ** of the empire in the 4th and 5th centuries was a gradual and complex process. Polytheism did not disappear overnight, especially in the western provinces, where the Christian bishops waged a running battle against beliefs and practices they condemned more than the Christian laity ** did. The boundaries between religious communities were much more fluid in the 4th century than they would become thanks to the repeated efforts of religious leaders, the powerful bishops who now led the church, to rein in their followers and enforce a more rigid set of beliefs and practices. The general prosperity was especially marked in the East, where population was still expanding till the 6th century, despite the impact of the plague which affected the Mediterranean in the 540s. In the West, by contrast, the empire fragmented politically as Germanic groups from the north, Goths, Vandals, Lombards, etc., took over all the major provinces and established kingdoms that are best described as post-Roman. The most important of these were that of the Visigoths in Spain, destroyed by the Arabs between 711 and 720, that of the Franks in Gaul, c. 511-687, and that of the Lombards in Italy, 568 to 774. These kingdoms foreshadowed the beginnings of a different kind of world that is usually called medieval. In the East, where the empire remained united, The reign of Justinian is the high-water mark of prosperity and imperial ambition. Justinian recaptured Africa from the Vandals in 533, but his recovery of Italy from the Ostrogoths left that country devastated and paved the way for the Lombard invasion. By the early 7th century, the war between Rome and Iran had flared up again, and the Sasanians, who had ruled Iran since the 3rd century, launched a wholesale invasion of all the major eastern provinces, including Egypt. When Byzantium, as the Roman Empire was now increasingly known, recovered these provinces in the 620s, it was just a few years away, literally, from the final major blow, which came, this time, from the southeast. The expansion of Islam from its beginnings in Arabia has been called the greatest political revolution ever to occur in the history of the ancient world. By 642, barely 10 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death, large parts of both the Eastern Roman and Sasanian empires had fallen to the Arabs in a series of stunning confrontations. However, we should bear in mind that those conquests, which eventually, a century later, extended as far afield as Spain, Sind, and Central Asia, began in fact with the subjection of the Arab tribes by the emerging Islamic State. First within Arabia and then in the Syrian desert and on the fringes of Iraq. As we will see in Theme 4, the unification of the Arabian Peninsula and its numerous tribes was the key factor behind the territorial expansion of Islam.